Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Tillotson, President of Faith Baptist Bible College and Theological Seminary. It's my privilege to welcome you to our 5th annual Refresh Conference. Our theme this year is navigating the personal challenges in ministry. As we serve the Lord on the front lines, there are many challenges that all of us face. I believe that these messages will encourage you and hopefully refresh you spiritually. I hope you enjoy these messages from our conference.
Turn to Acts chapter 15, if you would. We'll get there. Thank you, Dr. Jim. It's a pleasure to be here and be a part of the ministry here. The folks that just gave a quick promo for the school, outstanding people. Our reps, our guys are just great guys and great products of faith, and so we're glad to be here. The sessions that were given were topics that were given, as Dr. Pettit mentioned last night, and there were, I think, 3 that weren't taken. One was on the prodigal, and I said to Dr. Jim, you're going to need to do that because ain't nobody going to take that one, and so that was awesome. And then the other one was what we heard last night on taking care of yourself, and I'm not sure he's got a life lesson in that or life model, but he hit it on the head. And the other one was the one we're going to talk about today on disagreements and confrontation in relationships. And I'm not sure I'm the one that should be doing that either, quite frankly, because I'm of the nature that if there's conflict, I don't really want to have to mess with it. I'm born and bred in California, and I grew up thinking if there's conflict, just ignore it and go to the beach. And so, and then in God's sense of humor, when he got a hold of me at 20, and then went into ministry, it seems like that's positionally is what I end up having to deal with in different fronts. On a camp level and in counseling, and then in the college as well. And then we went into the pastorate, and it was so easy for going into 19 years. No conflict, everybody got along. So sheep bite, and shepherds are supposed to love, and so it all worked out. And then we came here, and this has been paradise, actually. Everybody loves each other all the time, and it's great. So we really, faith has been blessed in so many good ways, and happy to be a part of this. So there's a lot of different ways I'd like to go into this. Maybe the easiest way is to use a simple illustration. And as you see in your title about crack, when your relationships need to be confronted and restored, and a few years ago I'd got an iPhone, I don't know what it was, 10 I think at the time, and we had a deal with a company out there in Guam that we got a free iPhone. iPhones out there are not as pricey as they are here. And so I got a phone, and I decided I'm going to take care of this thing, so I bought a very expensive cover. And I had not been able to get, at that time, it was kind of new where you get this screen glass to cover this, but I had a really nice leather case. And I kid you not, I had less than a week, and I was walking from my living room. There's one step down to the family room, and I didn't notice it. I mean, you kind of like, I knew it was there. I stepped down, and my iPhone flipped out of my hand. And you know how everything kind of goes in slow motion, and my mind was like, I have the protective case. So it was like this. So I opened the case. As it went down, it slowly opened and landed, bam, on this quarry tile. And I thought, no problem, I got this expensive case. And I picked it up, and my glass was shattered. I'm not talking about the protective case cover. I didn't have that. I mean, I had the case, but not this glass piece. So the actual screen itself is shattered. I was so mad at myself. And so we had a guy in our church, David McApinlock. I went down to the store, in Guam's remote, but they do have some technology. And I said, David, I'm an idiot. This is what happened. So he says, well, I can get it, and here, I'll give you a deal, $270. Like, you gotta be kidding me. I'm a pastor, come on. So anyway, he got it fixed within a few days. And I kid you not, 5 days later, same process. I did the same thing. Almost exactly the same place. Now I'm like so torqued at myself that first of all, I didn't tell Tammy about it for like a day or two. And I went to my office. It was shattered. And how many of you have ever done at least one time? Let me see your hands. Come on, be honest. Okay, I feel better now. So I went to my office. I got Scotch tape. And I Scotch tape. And I 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks, I left it like that. I was so mad at myself, like, this is what you deserve. Like, you're gonna go into purgatory, man. And so, anyway, oh man. So that next Sunday, I don't remember what I was preaching on. It was about this topic, but it wasn't this passage. And I used that illustration. And then I said, if you can picture that, you can picture what any of our relationships look like sometimes today. Nationally, politically, in our neighborhoods, at our work, in our churches, in our homes. And I said, I don't want to oversimplify this, but the reality is there's often we have relationships that are cracked. And sometimes we don't know what to do. Sometimes we do know what to do, and we don't really want to do it because we like to avoid conflict, and or it's like his problem, and you get over it, and then you just move on. And it got quiet on that Sunday morning and so we just lived with this Scotch tape part of life for a long time. And I'm not sure that's how God really wants it. In fact, I know that's not what he wants. You imagine being able to walk through life, and there are disagreements, and there are sometimes things you have to do and confronting, and that's a part of church, it's a part of families, that's a part of life, and disagreements happen. And so I want to talk about that today, and you have the notes in front of you. And I just want to go through 3 kind of basic questions about this. I think Les, yesterday when he was preaching, and in essence, you can live with cracked relationships, and it won't necessarily hinder your function and hinder doing mission. But it will affect the fellowship. It will affect a sense of this is so awesome. And all of you as pastors could tell multiple stories, as I can, of you preaching and it's great, and then you see so-and-so and you see so-and-so, and you think, boy, I wish they would just deal with that. And then sometimes it's actually with you, and you don't even know what you did. And I told someone, we were talking late last night about something, I said this morning, I said politicians only have to get 51%. The pastors, we want to get 100%. You could sit out, you could preach awesome message, and one guy's got, bad acid reflux, and you think it's you. What did I say? So you're going to make sure you go talk to him because you want to get 100%. So my mind went to a lot of different pictures in the Bible, actually, and I have them in your notes. When you think of confrontation, my mind races immediately to Nathan when he confronted David, and he was David dealing personal sin, and you're the man. And then I thought about Jesus with the Pharisees and dealing with national sin, with religious sin, with the whole reason why he came in Matthew 23, and he often had said, woe to you. And he was dealing with issues. And then my mind went to Paul with Peter, who did confront Peter to his face in Galatians 2 and dealt with really kind of church hypocrisy and leadership. But we find ourselves here with Paul and Barnabas, and many of you maybe have preached on this. I have one other time, a couple of times, but not necessarily in this context. And so I thought we'd just take a look at this passage for a bit, and what do you do when there are differences with people? And in this case, it's about a person. And disagreements are a part of life, and how you work through this even within the church, and questions that often reveal some of the issues that become sore spots and divisions within a church, and you as a leader are trying to work through that. I mean, questions like, as one list, should the Sunday school meet before the worship service or after? Should a church have adult Sunday school or just one longer service? Or should people being baptized wear robes or casual clothes? Big issues, Or, should churches build churches or rent public buildings or meet in homes? And if you're going to build a building, should you have all the cash before you go into any kind of a debt load? Or missionaries, should missionaries be supported for certain terms or just for life? Or should church planning missionaries take precedent over other mission agencies and mission opportunities? Or should people simply pledge your annual giving or mail it in? Or could you use online? Or the whole area of worship. Should you sing from the hymnal or use PowerPoint? Or is it okay to sing music composed in the last 20 years? Or is it, the older the music, the better, the more sacred? Or, is music in a worship service even should be? It just goes on and on and on. So I'm trying to set the table to understand that we all have to live with it, and sometimes you kind of pray, like, Lord, help us with this. I humorously read the little prayer of a little girl who said, Dear God, I bet it is very hard for you to love everybody in the whole world. There's only 4 people in my family, and I just can't do it. Or the little boy who said, Dear Lord, maybe Cain and Abel wouldn't have killed each other so much if they had their own rooms. So, if you understand that, let's read this text, and then let's just talk about really why is this in the narrative and a perspective, and then give you, I think, what would be lessons that we could learn, and we'll be done. So, Acts 15, pick it up in verse 35. Paul also and Barnabas continued in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. And some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, Let us go again and visit our brothers in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they're doing. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark, but Paul thought it not good to take with him them, and departed from them from Pamphylia, and he went not with them to the work. And that contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark, and he sailed to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas, and he departed, being recommended by the brethren under the grace of God, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, and confirming the churches. So I would ask the question, therefore, so why is this in the narrative? And again, lots of reasons, but I think one of them would be to document the difficult work of advancing the gospel. I mean, as you know, in the context of the book of Acts, the book of transitions, and it is the link, the bridge between the gospels and the epistles, and it helps us know exactly what the word for the book is. The book of Acts, it's action, and it tells us all about how the church grew. And whether you want to take in Acts 1:8 and start with Jerusalem, with the birth of the church, and went to Judea, Samaria, and the expansion of the church, and then to the uttermost and the actual fulfillment of the church. However you want to divide the book of Acts, or whether it's the focus on Peter and then eventually to Paul, but certainly Acts 15 is the first of what we would look back on Christian history and say, here are 7 church councils, and they were major discussions. In Acts 15, the first end of this Acts 15 is all about doctrinal differences, and it was the purity of the gospel, that it was by faith the gospel was given, and it was not because of the law, and we don't want to add to that. And the Judaizers, that was continual hindrance to Paul. And so they worked through this, and they ended up having the discussion and went from Antioch down to Jerusalem, and James was there, and they worked through this in discernment, discretion. They were taking in the whole of the Jewish beliefs and people coming to Christ and understanding this, as Peter and Barnabas had been out in the Gentile world, non-Jewish world. Let's pull this together and let's boil this down. This is what's most important. And they took a letter and they came back to the church at Antioch and they read it, and all seemed to work out. I wrote in my Bible years ago the overview of Acts 15. When God works, Satan wars. At the end of the day, when you hear something going on in some dissension, whether that's doctrinal particularly, or even within the church body, that you know that when God is working, Satan's warring. And I've always looked at, anytime you have conferences like this, it's before this conference, it's something's going to come up, and it's a big deal, and you get so much focus and time to putting out fires and killing snakes that by the time you actually get to a big event, you don't have much time to pray for that, because you're so putting out stuff before you get here. And every time that God is working, Satan is warring. And so once they worked through all of that, then Paul and Barnabas, they continued in Antioch, and good things were happening. And the church at Antioch, to me, is a model church of sending out missions, and they were teaching. And so Paul then says, and it seems to me that Paul himself now is a bit of the leadership as that first missionary journey, and this really is the beginning of a second missionary journey. And I think it helps us to know how those differences are so important, but it is helping us to know that just because, okay, here they go on a second missionary journey and everything's just awesome, that before they even got off the ground there were issues, and they couldn't come together about a very important part, which is who's going to be on the team. And so you understand that there was already difficulties going into this second missionary journey. I wrote a second reason for this early church narrative, and I think the other reason why Luke documents this after he puts out the Gospel of Luke, he also, I think, put it in to reveal the humanness of God's workmen. And disagreements many times are inevitable. Paul and Barnabas agreed on the importance of the trip. They couldn't agree on the composition. It was disturbing, it was painful, and these conflicts are, and you can only imagine how awkward it got with others that heard about it, whether they were in the room or they were around, but eventually they understood these guys can't get their heads together about their decision. More probably could be written about it, but it's not. As one particular author, I think, wisely noted, he said, quote, "We are reminded yet again that many great speeches and vital events went unreported by the Bible's authors." I mean, there's probably more could be written here, but it wasn't. And under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, each brother and each author, had to choose which events and sayings to include or exclude. And in many cases, this leaves readers wanting more, even grappling with unanswered questions. And I think it's to be true as well about this particular passage. So we can take it for what it is, and we can add all the rest of the scriptures that we do know to know that eventually, as we read here, there was a division. And I think a third reason why this is put in is to prove that conflict can be restored. And it doesn't just say it right here in the book of Acts, because that's not the point of the book of Acts, but as you take all the rest of the pieces, you do realize that it was restored. You don't find any other attitude that Paul displays in any of these writings. I mean, this is basically almost 15 years after the start of the church, and things move forward. It's not the first time they had issues and they had conflicts, and they were big as the church grew, including major sin of Ananias and Sapphira, of issues of Stephen, who was stoned. And I mean, they were big issues here, but eventually this was something like, these are godly men. These are church leaders. These are teachers. These are people that are having differences, and it's not just differences related to, Christian liberties. And sometimes that is even a huge issue. It comes down to they're disagreeing about a person. You can only imagine the conversation that went on. And it doesn't say all of that, but obviously Barnabas, that really, really wanted John Mark, that was a family connection, and he was so driven by being his nickname of the encourager that, of course, you can only hear him saying, Paul, come on. I want to take him with us. And you can only imagine Paul, like, there's no way. We're going into warfare. That dude left us. And I'm not going to take this risk of him coming back. You really? And you can only imagine Barnabas like, of course, come on. Who stepped up and spoke for you, Paul? And you can imagine Paul's like, don't go there. Do not go there. We're talking about John Mark. Don't shift the folk. I mean, and the reality is they both have legit points. Like, you can only imagine Paul's like, we got to move on this thing, and we cannot take him. And Barnabas like, yeah, we can, and we should, and give him a chance. Or, listen, let's take him, and he'll be on probation, okay? And we'll go for away, and there's always ships coming back, and we'll just put him on like we did before. Give him a second chance. This is like dean office conversations, like. And obviously, we do know the story, and in which they as it says, Paul fought it not good. I mean, it was in his DNA that he was like, I am determined this isn't going to happen. And so the phrasing, the contention was so sharp between them. The disagreement was so pointed. And were both these guys stubborn? Were both of them like they dug their heels in? And so everybody got a lot of different opinions about this. Some of them I think would be true. One of them would be, it might be that they on the first missionary journey, what does it say in Acts 13? They prayed. And then these were the people, and they sent them out. You get to the second missionary journey, you see nothing about prayer here. So what does that lead us to think? Oh, well, therefore, this was just some big carnal endeavor? And I don't think that's the right conclusion. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe the reality is that, God knew that I'm going to take something so very difficult and a decision that maybe could have went one way or another, and God knew in His great providence, divine sovereignty overruled man's stupidity and said, I got to get two things going here. And so the book of Acts was about the gospel, and so it covered Paul, so it not necessarily mean that Paul was right and Barnabas was, put into the bullpen for a while. It could have been that the fact is that God knew this, I'm going to let this happen, and I'm going to use this as so often you do, take beauty out of ashes, and what you meant it for evil against each other, I'm going to make it for good, because for those next 10 years or so, maybe a little bit more than that, Barnabas does go back to his home area, takes John Mark, disciples him, helps him grow and mature, so that we do know that eventually who became Peter's son in the faith? Of course, it was John Mark. And who's the one that penned the gospel named after him? Seems to me like, okay, you had a failure, John, and yeah, you had connections there at Jerusalem, and you grew up seeing all that went on in the life of Christ, and you had a failure, but it wasn't fatal and it wasn't final, and eventually with Barnabas' help, it groomed him. And we do know by other passages that Paul mentions, he never speaks negatively of John Mark. In fact, he said, I want him to come with me. Please bring him. So there was a repair of all of this. I jotted down the threefold perspective on strong disagreements. Number one, in every disagreement, there's one issue but several viewpoints. And in disagreements, each side does have some validity. And lastly, in heated disagreements, somebody usually gets hurt, and that's normally the problem. And when David said, Psalms 133, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. And it was just a few years later in Paul's own writings to churches that we see him making statements about unity and making statements about thinking alike and making statements about humbleness of mind. And I sometimes wonder when his mind went back to this with Barnabas, and that everybody in the churches knew that eventually. Was that part of the reason why Paul mentions this statement through many of his epistles? So for the time that we do have, let me give you what we can learn, what I would call take-home truths that may be helpful to all of us today, because you might be in a place where as soon as you get in the car and you head home, you're going to have a conversation with your wife about one person in your church that you're immediately thinking of right now. Or some of you have somebody on your staff that you know, I got to deal with this. And it might be sin issues, which sometimes hard, but you know, and I got to deal with this. But I'm just talking about differences. I mean, in this case, it really was just about a guy. Like, this is how I saw it, and this is how he saw it. And, you know, well, it's your family, of course, and it's nepotism. Come on, get rid of it. And there's others who say, hey, listen, you know, and you have disagreements, and you stuff it for a while, and you might even have a disagreement with your authority, your pastor, or somebody, and you know, all of a sudden your respect kind of went down a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I used to, but because you disagree. We're not talking about sin right now. We're talking about an opinion. And eventually, when some people move, I wonder, are you moving because you just couldn't fully now respect your leader because he disagreed? You disagreed with the decision. How do you deal with that? How do you work through that? You don't want that to be a reason for end up leaving ministry, doing whatever. When I left Northland in 2000, my constant conversation was, I have no problem with Northland. I love Les Olaw. And he still makes me laugh. And there are times, many times, that disagreement about college, but hey, this is what you feel? I'm all for it. I'm in. Let's roll with that. And I felt the same way related to camp. And he's often, like, he probably thought I was an idiot. You know, I was 13 years younger than him, and he'd always be supportive. So in church work, when God begins working, Satan begins working. And warring. So here's my 4 takeaways. Not complicated. But as I read this, I think this is what you can take away. And there's a couple different particular books that I put together. And this one is Surviving Friendly Fire by Ron Dunn. I think it's out of print. And there's another one out of Insights for a Living. Really, really helpful. Number 1, when in a disagreement, you work hard to see the other point of view. In a disagreement, you work hard to see the other point of view. And I wonder whether when Paul, who saw the same issues of disagreements at the church at Ephesus, and here's his young protege in Timothy, who's pastoring, and he wrote his own personal comments to Timothy that was inscripturated, but here you find to the very church, and I wonder why he made the statement, with all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And I'm going to tell you, Paul was human. And I think if there was something that he was just pricked in his conscience, or he felt like this was all wrong, and this should have never happened, somewhere along the line, you know, something would have come out. But we're talking, 10 years later, and he's still like, hey, this is truth. And I think he lived it. You don't have to think alike. You do have to think together. And I think that's what we're talking about here. And that Philippians 2 mentality that we heard about. Fact number 2 is, it's not only when a disagreement you work hard to see the other point of view, but when both sides have validity, you seek a wise compromise. And so when you see Philippians 2, the same theme, fulfill my joy. Like, make me happy that you be like-minded. You have the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Have a strife, or was it out of vainglory? It seemed to me they didn't have a vainglory. They're like, we care about the gospel. We're trying to decide who to go on this team, and we disagree. And so there was a difference here. And did they come to a wise compromise? I think God sovereignly must have brought all that about. But we certainly in our little world as well could take note about this. And we have 2 fists in one mouth, so you got to be careful. And David Augsburger years ago said conflict is natural and everyone should be willing to come away in an attempt to resolve things. A willingness to give a little will lead to a working solution which is satisfactory to everyone. Compromise is a gift to human relationships. And we move forward on the basis of thoughtful, careful consensus and compromise in most decisions in conflict. I'm talking about personal opinions here, okay? I'm not talking about doctrine and compromise. I'm talking about the relationships, and often it is with you. You might get along fine with that, but you have a staff, you have a family. Most of the time, you marry the opposite of who and what you are in your personality. So if you're the one that, just roll with it, your wife might not be as easy to deal with that. And often she will come to your aid and your defense and think you're not the wrong one. And so she takes up your offense, and it gets worse then. And that's not what anybody needs. And God doesn't give grace when you end up sharing your difficulty and your difference with somebody else. It's not a part of the problem solution. And God gives you grace for this, to work through this. God doesn't give grace to them. So guess what they do? They pick up your offense. And if you're pastoring, you can't end up having those kind of conversations. And this is why you have to work through that. And sometimes it does get public, which leads to number 3, that when the conflict persists, you got to care enough to work through it rather than walk out, or rather than make it vocal and make it public. And slamming a phone down in the middle of a conversation or breaking through the screen on the front door as you stomp into the street, it doesn't solve anything. Nor does a lengthy, manipulative, silent treatment, or bolting from a marriage, or quitting your job in a huff. That's not how to handle disagreements. You got to work through it and stay at it. And be willing to say, okay, we can work through this. And I think that's why, again, then Paul ends up writing to the church at Colossae in chapter 3. He talks in the middle of these exhortations about mortifying your flesh and mortifying your members and putting off and then putting on and getting dressed. He says, forbearing one another, forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, then even as Christ forgave you, do also. And above all these things, put on charity, put on love. That's the bond of perfectness. This is how God will end up putting it together. You got to forbear often. You got to put up with certain things. Like, this is just how they are. Sometimes personalities. You think about most leaders are double A batteried guys, and they're opinionated. All my friends are that way. It's like, and God knows we need that. I mean, I love Paul and I love his writings, but I don't think I want to work for the guy. And the Lord knows that's the people that God uses so strongly, because they're convinced about something like, this is what we're doing. And sometimes just like, I got to forbear. I got to just let it go. And sometimes you do have to forgive. Maybe that's what Paul was thinking. Like, I'm just going to forgive Barnabas for that. He's wrong. I'll forgive him. Literally, let it down. And then, of course, having that love, which the bond, it's the wraps of completeness, is you got to be flexible. You got to give and take a little bit. And that's not bad marriage advice either, may I add. I got to let it go, let it down, and be flexible. Like, it'll work. Every relationship that's successful is made up of two great forgivers. Every marriage is made up of two great forgivers. Every ministry that you know is successful is made up of multiple great forgivers. And it sounds so obvious. And it's like, I'm just saying the obvious here, right? But sometimes it's not so obvious. I mean, you obviously, you look back on Christian history and you see certain people that there are major differences. Augustine had major issues related to doctrinal issues. Martin Luther and Zwingli were like, they were like, about communion and a lot of other things. But I'm humored when I read about like awesome people. I'd love to live back in the mid-1850s or so with my cell phone. But, and man, those guys, here you got Spurgeon, who's like the largest Baptist church, and he's the man. And then Joseph Parker, who had the second largest Baptist church in London. These were like big dogs, man. And something got tweaked with Spurgeon, and he made a comment about Joseph Parker's going to theaters. And he really couldn't believe that a godly man's going to theaters. And what'd Parker do? He publicly shot back with, I don't smoke cigars. And it got so public like that, from then on, there was like no fellowship. It's sad to me. And parenthetically here for a minute, I don't think I'm that old, okay? In my attitude, like age is an attitude, so I don't sometimes feel like I'm that old. But I think I'm there now. As camp director called me and said, hey, I want you to speak at a conference. And I'm like, yeah, great. And so so I'm publicly saying this, so I'm just going to say it one time, so it's kind of humorous, but so I said, well, yeah, I'd like to speak. That's great. My mind was on, because we had chapel and had things related to seniors coming, and he said, I want you to speak at the seniors retreat. My mind's like, seniors, of course. Seniors. And so we're talking, it's September, and it's like, September, you don't do like senior high school retreats in September. And then he told me about a guy that's doing it, and he's like older than I am, and I'm like, bing, bing, bing. We're not talking about seniors in high school. We're talking about like seniors, senior citizens. This just happened a week ago. I'm like, oh, Lord, I'm done. And so the older you get, the more you realize that some of this is just flat silly. And we have a whole generation that we are trying to reach, and they don't have any room or time for this baloney. They'd rather go, hang that. Really? You're going to talk about what? It's not about doctrine. It's not about traditions. It's about Christian liberty. I ain't got time for that. And we're losing them to other broader scenarios that I'm not sure that's always the best for them. So, therefore, let's work at this. And lastly, as I close, we do need to understand that when it cannot be resolved, graciously agree to disagree without becoming disagreeable. And I think this was the point, and I think you got 1 Corinthians, but the reality is what I meant to put into there was Romans 12, because Paul himself, to that church in Rome, said, if it be possible, as much as lies in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, rather give place unto wrath. It's written, vengeance is mine, I'll repay, says the Lord. God knows that He'll work through this. As Martin Luther said, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. And I think there's a whole lot of truth to that. And so, as I started, my little iPhone, I finally got out of purgatory, and I took it back to David, and I said, put a screen on that. I wrote the iPhone cover place and said, you need to give me your money back because it says it protects and it didn't protect. So I had everybody to blame except for myself. And it all worked out. And it's one thing about an iPhone and a cracked screen. But it's another, not looking at a screen when you're looking at life and you're looking at people. And I would encourage you that if you're in that boat, then you need to end up taking this advice, and it'll help you because the cause is too great. It's too great. God, thank you for the time. Thank you for these folks that listen. We're grateful. We love you. Thank you for the privilege it is to meet together and use the rest of the sessions as well to challenge our hearts for the cause of the gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.